The empire had endured for generations, long enough that endurance itself no longer felt remarkable. Long before factories darkened European skies with smoke, before railways cut across landscapes and steam engines reshaped the meaning of labor, China already believed it had reached a state of completion. It was not moving toward a future in the way newer nations imagined progress. Instead, it was preserving a balance refined over centuries, a system that appeared to function precisely as it should. From the imperial court in Beijing, the world seemed ordered and predictable. Seasons arrived on schedule. Rice was planted and harvested, as it always had been. Taxes were assessed, collected, and recorded. Memorials were written in careful brushstrokes and presented to the throne according to ritualized procedure. Nothing in the daily rhythm of governance suggested urgency. Nothing hinted at looming danger. There was no sense that the empire needed to change, and no reason, from its own perspective, to believe that it should. China was vast beyond easy comprehension, its population numbering in the hundreds of millions, its rivers feeding endless stretches of farmland, its cities alive with artisans, merchants, scholars, and officials bound together by traditions older than many foreign nations themselves. For centuries, it had served as the center of gravity for the global economy. Silk, porcelain, and tea flowed outward across oceans and deserts, passing through countless hands before reaching distant courts and marketplaces. Silver flowed inward in return, accumulating steadily in imperial vaults and private fortunes. This imbalance was well understood beyond China's borders. Foreign kingdoms recognized the disparity even as they struggled beneath it. Still, they came. They crossed vast distances by sea, ships battered by storms and disease, crews exhausted and desperate to make their voyages worthwhile. They brought gifts intended to impress: mechanical clocks, glassware, woolen cloth, intricate devices that chimed or moved at the turn of a key. The response from the Qing court was polite, distant, and unmoved. China did not need these things. From the emperor's perspective, foreign nations were small, fragmented, and culturally immature. They existed at the edges of the known world, useful perhaps as trading partners, but not equals. The empire referred to itself as the Middle Kingdom, not as a boast, but as an assumption. It was simply the center, and everything else orbited around it. Trade was permitted, but only under strict conditions designed to reinforce that hierarchy. By the late 18th century, nearly all Western trade with China had been funneled into a single southern port city, Canton. It was a humid place where river water met the sea, where the air carried the combined smells of salt, spices, sweat, and smoke. Foreign merchants were allowed to trade there, and nowhere else. They lived in confined factory compounds outside the city walls. They could not bring wives or children. They could not travel inland. They could not learn the Chinese language or communicate directly with imperial officials. Every transaction passed through approved intermediaries known as the Hong merchants. The system ensured control. It kept foreigners dependent, isolated, and manageable. Silver flowed in. Goods flowed out. For China, it worked beautifully. For the foreigners, it did not. Back in Britain, tea had become more than a luxury. It was woven into daily life, shaping habits and social rituals across every level of society. Demand seemed endless, and the profits were immense. Yet China did not want British goods. No matter how much cloth, metalware, or machinery Britain offered, the answer remained unchanged. Silver only. Year after year, British ships carried silver eastward. At first, the loss felt manageable. Then, it felt concerning. Eventually, it became impossible to ignore. Britain's silver reserves thinned. Merchants complained. Officials grew uneasy. Economists warned that the imbalance was unsustainable, that wealth was draining from the kingdom at a dangerous pace. Somewhere within the offices of the British East India Company, a solution began to take shape. Not a weapon, not a treaty, a product. Far from China, in the fields of British-controlled India, farmers cultivated a flowering plant. When its seed pods were scored, they released a thick, milky sap. The sap was collected, dried, and processed into a dark, sticky substance, opium. It was not unknown in China. For centuries, it had existed quietly within traditional medicine, used sparingly, swallowed rather than smoked, regulated and limited. But smoking opium changed everything. The effect was faster, stronger, more immersive. It reshaped perception. The British understood this. At first, the trade was cautious and discreet, technically illegal, but lightly enforced. A few chests here, a few shipments there. Foreign ships anchored just beyond Chinese territorial waters, flying no flags and making no announcements. At night, small Chinese boats slipped out to meet them, returning before dawn with hidden cargo. Silver began to move in a new direction. At first, no one in Beijing noticed. The empire was enormous, information traveled slowly, and local officials handled local matters. Opium was still viewed as a minor vice, confined largely to wealthy merchants and idle elites. A habit, not a crisis. In Canton, however, the change was already visible. Opium dens appeared quietly. They were not openly advertised, just a door left slightly ajar, a lantern burning longer than usual, a familiar sweet, acrid scent lingering in the air. The early customers were officials, scholars, and wealthy traders, men with time and money. They lay on wooden platforms, pipes resting in practiced hands as smoke softened worries and blurred responsibility. Time dissolved. Silver paid for the relief. No alarms sounded. No one panicked. This was how decline began. Not with invasion, not with rebellion, but with comfort, with smoke, with the growing belief that tomorrow would look much like today. For a while it did. Ships continued to crowd Canton harbor. Clerks tallied accounts. Merchants bargained loudly. Life appeared stable, even prosperous. Yet beneath the surface, something essential had shifted. Silver note it leaked away. Officials noticed shortages. Taxes became harder to collect. Peasants complained of rising prices. Magistrates blamed poor harvests, corrupt subordinates, unlucky years. Anything but the truth. When reports finally reached the imperial court, they arrived fragmented and cautious, wrapped in language designed to soften their meaning. They spoke of moral weakness, of foreign influence, of declining discipline. No one yet grasped the scale of what was unfolding. In villages far from the coast, men sold tools to buy a few more moments of relief. Fields went untended. Families waited for wages that never came. The empire still stood. The banners still flew. The rituals continued, but the foundation was thinning. Quietly, relentlessly, chest by chest, the poppy plant was doing what armies had failed to do for centuries. It was hollowing China from within. As night settles over Canton, lanterns flicker along the waterfront. Somewhere nearby, a pipe is lit and smoke curls upward before disappearing into the darkness. Tomorrow will look familiar. For now, morning comes to Canton quietly, filtered through heavy air and low clouds that cling low over the harbor. The city wakes without urgency. Merchants lift shutters that have been open the same way for years. Porters stretch stiff backs and wait for instructions. Boats drift in from the river carrying cargo, scraps of news and rumors from inland districts. At first glance, nothing appears unusual. The rhythms of trade resume as they always have, familiar and reassuring. Yet small details begin to intrude upon the calm. A merchant hesitates longer than expected before unlocking his shop. A dockworker moves with unusual slowness, his gaze unfocused. A clerk fumbles with counting rods, losing track of numbers he once handled effortlessly. The changes are subtle, easy to overlook, easier still to explain away. Opium is still spoken of as a habit rather than a dependency, a personal weakness rather than a systemic threat. Officials reassure themselves that moral instruction and modest enforcement will correct the problem in time, unaware that time is no longer working in their favor. By the 1820s, the volume of opium entering China increased steadily, almost predictably, year after year. What began as a quiet trickle grows into a steady stream. What was once confined to a narrow circle of elites spreads outward, crossing social boundaries with quiet efficiency. Merchants introduce the drug to clerks. Clerks pass it to porters. Porters carry it back to villages far from the coast. Opium becomes cheaper, more accessible, and in some places easier to obtain than food. With every pipe smoked, silver changes hands, and with every exchange, the balance shifts further away from what it once was. For centuries, silver had flowed into China like a river fed by distant tributaries, filling imperial vaults, stabilizing currency, and anchoring daily economic life. Now, for the first time in living memory, the current reverses direction. Silver begins to leave. At first, the amounts seem manageable. Officials notice shortages but assume the situation will correct itself. Trade has always fluctuated. Markets rise and fall. This, they believe, is no different. But the outflow does not slow. It accelerates. Prices rise unevenly, confusing buyers and sellers alike. Taxes become harder to collect. Farmers discover that the coins they receive no longer purchase what they once did. Rent increases quietly. Debts grow heavier. The empire's monetary system, long dependent on silver, begins to strain under pressures it was never designed to absorb. Local officials send reports northward, carefully phrased to avoid blame. They speak of temporary dislocation and economic pressure, urging patience. In Beijing, the court listens politely. The emperor reads the memorials, sets them aside, and turns his attention elsewhere. The empire has endured floods, famines, and rebellions before. This too is assumed to be temporary. Meanwhile, in Canton, opium dens multiply. They know demand has grown too large, too constant. Entire streets begin to carry the familiar sweet, sickly scent. Lamps burn late into the night. Smoke drifts through windows and narrow alleyways. Inside, the clientele has changed. No longer only wealthy officials reclining on carved platforms, but laborers, soldiers, craftsmen, even monks. People who once worked from dawn to dusk now spend long hours motionless, eyes half closed, bodies slowly weakening. Productivity collapses quietly. Fields are left unplanted. Workshops sit idle. Ships wait longer to be unloaded. Repairs are delayed. Schedules slip. No single failure causes alarm, but together they begin to loosen the structure that holds daily life in place. Families feel the effects first. A father misses work for a day, then tools are sold, furniture follows. Eventually, land itself is mortgaged or lost. Conversations turn into arguments. Meals grow smaller. Children are sent to work earlier than planned. Across southern China, similar scenes unfold, largely unseen by the imperial court but deeply felt by those living them. At the same time, foreign merchants prosper. British and American traders refine their operations with efficiency and better routes. Offshore warehouses anchored just beyond the reach of Chinese. The opium trade becomes organized, systematic, and extraordinarily profitable. The justification comes easily. They are not forcing anyone, they argue. They are merely supplying. If they do not sell, someone else will. The silver they collect purchases tea, silk, and porcelain, which they sell at home for immense profit. The imbalance that once troubled Britain has reversed. Silver drains from Chinese merchants find themselves trapped. The Hong merchants, once among the most powerful businessmen in the world, are caught between imperial expectations and foreign pressure. They are responsible for enforcing regulations they cannot control, while remaining accountable for foreigners who no longer fear consequences. Some comply, some resist, many quietly profit. Corruption spreads easily under such conditions. Officials tasked with enforcement are themselves addicted. Patrol captains accept bribes to look away. Inspectors schedule raids in advance, ensuring dens are empty when they arrive. The law remains on paper, but its presence in daily life is thin and inconsistent. When arrests occur, punishment follows familiar patterns. Poor addicts are beaten or imprisoned. Wealthy offenders pay. The message becomes clear. Opium is dangerous in principle, tolerable in practice. As the decade wears on, the consequences deepen. Silver shortages disrupt tax collection. Provincial governments struggle to fund a basic administration. Soldiers go unpaid. Infrastructure decays slowly. Local unrest grows. Not yet rebellion, but frustration. Complaints become more open. Rumors travel faster. Trust in authority weakens. Scholars debate the crisis in tea houses and private gatherings, some blaming foreign exploitation, others pointing to internal decay, many recognizing both. A common fear emerges, spoken quietly but felt widely. If this continues, the empire will not collapse in a dramatic moment. It will simply stop functioning. The Qing system depends on balance between center and province, between revenue and obligation, between authority and compliance. Opium erodes that balance without noise or spectacle. As night falls over Canton, the harbor feels different. Commerce continues, but beneath its familiar sounds lies tension. Goods still move, but the direction of wealth has changed. Silver flows outward now, coin by coin, chest by chest. In distant villages, men choose the pipe over the plow. In cities, clerks neglect duties once performed with pride. In government offices, reports are softened, delayed, or quietly ignored. And in Beijing, the court begins to sense that something is wrong. Not yet fully understood, but no longer dismissible. Soon the emperor will conclude that stronger action is required. Someone will be sent south, with authority and orders. But by the time that decision is made, The roots of the problem will already be deep, too deep to remove without tearing something else apart. By the late 1830s, the problem could no longer be disguised or softened through careful language. Reports arriving in Beijing grew more urgent, their phrasing less restrained than before, as provincial officials began to speak openly of collapsing tax revenues, of soldiers abandoning their posts, and of entire districts failing to meet grain quotas that had once been routine. What alarmed the court most, however, was silver. For generations, silver had been the empire's financial backbone, underpinning taxes, wages, and trade with quiet reliability. Now the numbers are no longer aligned. What flowed into the treasury no longer matched what flowed out, and the imbalance grew wider each year. Moral decay could be ignored, corruption could be tolerated, inefficiency could be endured. But a hemorrhaging treasury threatened the state itself, and that reality could no longer be postponed. Within the Forbidden City, advisors debated in measured tones. Some urged caution, warning that sudden disruption along the coast could provoke unrest and worsen instability. Others argued that delay had already allowed the crisis to deepen beyond control, that incremental responses had only emboldened those who profited from disorder. The emperor listened, weighing the risks in silence, aware that whatever choice he made would ripple far beyond the immediate problem. In the end, he decided to act decisively. A man would be sent south, someone known for discipline, integrity, and unwavering loyalty to the throne, someone believed to be untouched by the habits consuming the coastal cities. His name was Lin Zexu. Lin was not a merchant seeking profit, nor a soldier pursuing glory. He was a scholar official shaped by classical education and a deep belief in moral governance. To him, the crisis unfolding along the southern coast was not merely economic or political, it was ethical. Opium, in his view, poisoned both body and spirit, and those who profited from it, whether foreign traders or Chinese collaborators, were betraying the empire. In early 1839, Lin arrived in Canton, and the city felt his presence immediately. Processions of officials accompanied him through the streets. Notices were posted, inspections announced, and meetings called. For the first time in years, enforcement did not feel symbolic, it felt real. Lin began by demanding accountability from within the Chinese administration itself. He ordered officials to confess their involvement, dismiss those found complicit, and punished others publicly to signal that indulgence had ended. Addicts within the bureaucracy were forced to choose between rehabilitation and removal from office. Many chose neither, slipping quietly out of sight. Only then did Lin turn his attention to the foreign merchants. He summoned them and addressed them not as equals, but as guests who had overstayed their welcome. His message was direct and uncompromising. Opium was illegal. It was destroying China, and it would stop. Foreign traders reacted with disbelief. They had heard proclamations before, moral condemnations issued and forgotten, threats that dissolved under pressure. This felt different. Lin ordered all opium surrendered. Not negotiated over, not taxed, but confiscated outright. Ships were blockaded, warehouses sealed, and trade suspended. Foreign merchants protested, appealed to their governments, and insisted they were traders rather than criminals. Lin remained unmoved. For weeks, tension filled Canton as foreign traders were confined to their compounds. Supplies dwindled and tempers flared. Eventually, under mounting pressure, the merchants complied, surrendering thousands of chests of opium to Chinese authorities. Lin ordered their destruction. Along the coast, trenches were dug, and the opium was mixed with lime and salt before being flushed into the sea under the watchful eyes of officials and laborers. It was a symbolic act, an attempt to wash the poison away and restore moral order, but the gesture carried consequences far beyond what Lin intended. To British merchants and officials, the destruction of opium represented a direct assault on property and profit. Compensation was demanded. Apologies were expected. None came. In Britain, outrage grew, and the narrative shifted quickly. What had been a lucrative but morally questionable trade was reframed as an issue of national honor and free commerce. China, it was argued, had insulted Britain, interfered with lawful trade, and humiliated British subjects. The fact that the trade was illegal in China mattered little in London. Back in Canton, the atmosphere grew brittle. Trade stalled, harbour traffic slowed, and while smuggling routes were disrupted, they were not eliminated. Addicts suffered withdrawal, and local unrest simmered beneath the surface. Lin pushed forward regardless, expanding enforcement inland, destroying dens, arresting dealers, and ordering public punishments. The suffering was immediate. Addicts endured violent withdrawal as families watched loved ones writhe and beg. Some recovered, many did not. The economic shock rippled outward as merchants lost income, laborers lost work, and officials struggled to maintain order. The cure, it seemed, was as painful as the disease itself. Then the warships appeared. British naval vessels arrived along the coast, their presence unmistakable, sleek and modern, armed with weapons China had never faced in combat. Negotiations followed, demands were issued, and ultimatums delivered. Lin stood firm, believing the empire could not yield without legitimizing the poison and those who sold it. But the balance of power had shifted more than he understood. China's military, designed for internal stability rather than external conflict, was unprepared. Its weapons were outdated, its command fragmented, and when fighting began, it was brief and devastating. British ships moved with speed and precision as Chinese defenses crumbled. Coastal forts fell, and rivers once thought secure became avenues of invasion. The reality became impossible to deny. The empire that had long seen itself as untouchable was vulnerable. In Beijing, panic replaced confidence. Lin was recalled, blame assigned, and new officials appointed. But the damage had already been done. The war that followed forced China to accept terms unthinkable only decades earlier, opening ports, ceding territory, and compromising sovereignty. Opium, ironically, continued to flow. The attempt to stop it had triggered something far larger. As the smoke of conflict drifted over the coast, a deeper truth emerged. The empire had not weakened because of a single decision, a single man, or even a single war. It had been eroded slowly and quietly over decades by addiction, by complacency, and by the belief that stability was permanent. As night returned to Canton, the harbor looked different now. Foreign ships no longer waited at a distance. They anchored openly and confidently. The old rules no longer applied, and the Qing dynasty, still standing, began to realize that survival would require something it had not needed for centuries: change. The war eventually ends, but nothing truly stops. The cannons fall silent along the southern coast. Treaties are signed in distant rooms, and officials on both sides declare that order has been restored. Ports reopen, foreign ships return to familiar harbors, now no longer hovering cautiously at the edge of Chinese waters, but anchoring openly and confidently under the protection of newly written agreements. On paper, the crisis appears resolved. In reality, the empire is weaker than it has ever been, and the forces set in motion by opium continue their work long after the fighting ends. The treaties imposed after the conflict reshaped China's relationship with the outside world in ways that would have been unthinkable only a generation earlier. Additional ports are forced open to foreign trade, ending centuries of carefully controlled access. Tariffs are fixed at low rates, depriving the imperial government of a critical source of revenue just as it needs funds the most. Foreign merchants gain legal protections that place them beyond the reach of Chinese law, creating enclaves where imperial authority no longer applies. And opium, the very substance that sparked the crisis, remains present. Officially discouraged, publicly condemned, but quietly tolerated, it continues to circulate through the empire, its trade now more entrenched than before. In Canton and across southern China, addiction does not disappear with the signing of treaties. Men who survived the crackdown return to the pipe, their bodies weakened but their dependency unchanged. New users take their place, drawn by habit, stress, and the ready availability of the drug. As foreign imports fluctuate, domestic cultivation expands inland, filling the gaps left by disrupted supply. The poppy begins to appear in Chinese soil itself, particularly in poorer regions where farmers, desperate for income, find that opium pays better than rice or wheat. What began as an external imbalance is now internalized, woven directly into the local economy, making the problem far harder to confront. This transformation proves devastating to the empire's moral authority. Laws against opium still exist, but enforcement becomes inconsistent and selective. Officials punish the poor while excusing the powerful. Local administrators, themselves underpaid and under pressure, accept bribes or simply look away. The people notice. Faith in the fairness of the state erodes as cynicism spreads. If the government cannot protect families from addiction, cannot enforce its own laws, and cannot stabilize the economy, then its claim to legitimacy begins to weaken. In the countryside, resentment grows quietly but steadily. Taxes remain high, even as silver grows scarce and prices rise. Peasants struggle to meet obligations that no longer reflect economic reality. When floods or droughts strike, relief arrives slowly or not at all. Granaries that once symbolized imperial foresight sit empty or mismanaged. Corruption siphons resources meant for aid. Communities are left to fend for themselves, relying on local networks or turning to desperation. Small uprisings flare briefly and fade, not yet large enough to threaten the dynasty, but frequent enough to signal deep dissatisfaction. At the imperial court, arguments multiply. Some officials blame foreign aggression, pointing to unequal treaties and military humiliation. Others argue that the true danger lies in moral decay and administrative weakness. Proposals for reforms circulate, but consensus is elusive. Each change threatens entrenched interests. Each delay allows conditions to worsen. While debates continue, the world beyond China accelerates. Industrialization transforms Europe and America, producing faster ships, more powerful weapons, and more efficient economies. China struggles to keep pace, constrained by institutions designed for stability rather than rapid adaptation. Opium's damage extends beyond health and economics. It exposes structural fragility within the Qing system itself. A state that relies on moral authority falters when corruption becomes visible and widespread. A bureaucracy that depends on balance collapses when imbalance persists for decades. The dynasty still governs, but increasingly it governs by habit rather than confidence, maintaining forms long after their substance has weakened. By the middle of the 19th century, the consequences compound. Rebellions grow larger and more destructive, fueled by hunger, resentment, and loss of faith. The Taiping Rebellion erupts with catastrophic violence, killing millions and devastating entire regions. While opium is not the sole cause, it plays its part, draining resources, weakening response, and undermining cohesion at precisely the moment unity is most needed. Foreign powers exploit the chaos, extracting further concessions, expanding influence, and embedding themselves more deeply into China's economic and political life. The empire begins to shrink, not immediately in territory but in spirit. Confidence fades. Initiative disappears. Officials focus on preserving their positions rather than governing effectively. In major cities, foreign enclaves grow prosperous and insulated, operating under different laws, while Chinese residents watch wealth accumulate just beyond their reach. The contrast breeds bitterness and quiet anger. In villages, elders speak of earlier times, of order and stability, of a world that no longer exists and may never return. And yet, daily life continues. Markets open each morning. Farmers plant when they can. Families endure loss and hardship with practiced resilience. Empires rarely fall in a single dramatic moment. More often they fade slowly, their authority thinning year by year. As night settles once more over Canton, the harbor appears busier than ever, crowded with ships from many nations, their lights reflecting off the water in broken patterns. Trade continues. Wealth moves. Power shifts. Somewhere inland, a poppy field blooms quietly. Somewhere else, a pipe is lit. The smoke drifts upward, thinner now, but still present. The empire breathes in and exhales something it can never fully release. As the 19th century continues, the Qing dynasty remains in place, but it governs a country that no longer resembles the empire it once ruled with such confidence. The structures of authority still exist, the rituals continue, and the language of stability remains, yet beneath the surface everything has grown more fragile. Opium, once introduced quietly as a trade commodity, has by now become an ordinary feature of life in many regions, its presence so familiar that it rarely shocks. It lingers in homes, in markets, in the rhythms of daily existence, no longer seen as an emergency but as a condition to be endured. Generations grow up knowing an empire shaped by weakness rather than strength. Children watch adults disappear into addiction or labor endlessly to support habits they did not choose. Families adapt, lowering expectations, learning to live with absence and decline. In some areas, opium use stabilizes rather than explodes, but stabilization does not mean recovery. It means permanence. The drug becomes part of the social fabric, altering work habits, family structures, and local economies in ways that are difficult to measure but impossible to reverse. The state attempts further reforms, introducing new schools, limited military modernization, and cautious engagement with foreign technology. These efforts achieve partial success, but they arrive slowly and unevenly, constrained by internal resistance and limited resources. Trust between the government and the people has been weakened too deeply to be restored quickly. Policies are announced, but belief no longer follows automatically. Compliance becomes transactional rather than moral, based on fear or necessity rather than loyalty. Foreign influence continues to expand, not only through force but through familiarity. Western goods, ideas, and institutions become increasingly visible in urban centers. Railways cut across landscapes once governed by seasonal rhythms. Telegraph lines carry information faster than imperial edicts can follow. The old balance between center and periphery shifts, leaving the court perpetually behind events it once would have controlled. Opium, though no longer the sole driver of decline, remains a symbol of how easily the empire was bent and how difficult it has been to straighten. By the time the Qing dynasty approaches its final years, the damage is no longer confined to any single cause. It is layered, accumulated, and normalized. Opium is part of that accumulation, not as a dramatic destroyer, but as a persistent erosion. It weakened bodies, strained families, drained silver, compromised officials, and exposed the limits of imperial power. It did not end the dynasty on its own, but it helped make the end possible. When the dynasty finally collapses, it does so amid confusion rather than spectacle. There is no single moment when everything breaks. Authority simply dissolves, leaving space for something new and uncertain to emerge. The old empire, once defined by order and continuity, becomes a memory, studied and debated long after it has disappeared from the world. And still, life continues. History moves on quietly. The smoke that once symbolized decline thins with time, dispersing into the wider air of memory. What remains is not a single lesson, but a reminder of how slowly empires change, and how small decisions, repeated over years, can reshape entire civilizations without ever announcing themselves as turning points. And so the story does not end with a final collapse or a clear resolution. It simply fades, like evening settling over a harbor, long accustomed to ships arriving and departing, carrying goods, ideas, and consequences in equal measure. The water still grows, the lights dim, and the past, heavy but distant, drifts gently into rest.